Most people assume slavery is a thing of the past. We hear about it in history books, stories of chains, plantations, and forced labor that seem distant from the modern world. But that's an illusion. The truth? Slavery never ended. It just changed form. It no longer looks like public auctions or legal ownership. Today, it hides behind deceptive contracts, corporate supply chains, and fake job offers that turn into lifelong debt traps. It thrives in factories, farms, construction sites, and even households, all while remaining invisible to most of the world. The biggest reason slavery persists? Most people don't recognize it when they see it. Not all slaves are in chains. Many are trapped by debt that can never be repaid, threats that make escape impossible, confiscated documents that strip away their rights, legal loopholes that make their exploitation seem normal. Governments and corporations rename it, calling it informal labor, attached workers, or contracted employees. But at the core, it's still the same brutal system of control and exploitation. This is not just a moral debate. This is a deep dive into how modern slavery operates, who profits from it, and why entire industries depend on its existence. We'll answer, how did slavery evolve into its modern form? What economic changes made it even worse? How can we predict exactly where it will happen? Why is slavery actually damaging to economies, not just its victims? This isn't speculation. This is hard data, real patterns, and undeniable evidence. By the end of this, one thing will be clear. Slavery didn't disappear. It adapted. And unless we start seeing it for what it really is, it will keep growing in the shadows, right in front of us. Slavery has always been about control, unpaid labor, and profit. But the way it operates today is vastly different from historical slavery. The old model, where enslaved people were expensive, legally recognized property, has given way to a modern system where forced labor is cheap, hidden, and easily replaced. Regardless of time period or legal status, slavery always involves three core elements: coercion and control. Victims are trapped through physical violence, debt, confiscation of documents, or psychological manipulation. Escape is not a real option. No real compensation. Some may receive minimal wages, food, or shelter, but never enough to gain independence or escape their conditions. Forced labor for economic gain. The enslaved person's work benefits others, while they remain trapped in a cycle of exploitation. What has changed is how slavery is hidden. It now operates under layers of subcontracting, legal loopholes, and economic systems that make exploitation easy to ignore. The shift from ownership to disposability. Old model. Slaveholders invested in their enslaved workers because they were expensive to purchase and maintain. New model. Enslaved workers are cheap and disposable. When they burn out, they are simply replaced. This shift explains why modern slavery is both larger in scale and more brutal than in the past. With little cost to traffickers or employers, human lives are treated as throwaway labor. Modern slavery exists not because of outdated traditions, but because today's economy enables it. The combination of cheap labor, globalization, and weak legal enforcement has made forced labor one of the most profitable hidden industries in the world. How economic shifts made slavery more widespread? The global labor surplus. There are more workers than jobs, making people desperate for work. This allows employers and traffickers to pay less, demand more, and ignore protections. The rise of outsourced exploitation. Instead of companies directly owning slaves, they work with subcontractors and third-party suppliers that use forced labor. This gives businesses a profit shield, allowing them to deny responsibility. The decline of worker protections. Many developing countries have weak labor laws, and even where laws exist, enforcement is almost non-existent. Without oversight, companies can exploit workers freely. The role of corruption. Traffickers and businesses rely on corrupt officials to keep forced labor hidden. In many regions, bribes ensure that slavery remains an open secret rather than a punishable crime. The economy doesn't just allow slavery, it rewards it. Businesses that exploit workers get lower costs, higher profits, and no real consequences. By design, the system values cheap labor over human dignity, which is why modern slavery isn't just persisting, it's expanding. Why slavery needs hard evidence. Slavery thrives in secrecy. Unlike historical slavery, there are no legal records, no property deeds, no official ownership. It hides under fake contracts, unregulated labor markets, and corporate supply chains that deny responsibility. So how do we prove it exists? We test it. We force the system to reveal itself. The three crucial tests. Tracking slave prices over time. If slavery still exists, we should see evidence in the cost of human beings today versus the past. Are slaves cheaper now? If so, why? Predicting where slavery thrives. If slavery isn't random, there must be conditions that allow it to flourish. Can we use economic and political data to predict where it will happen? Measuring slavery's economic and social damage. If slavery is as harmful as we claim, it should show up in economic and development data. Does it drag down wages? Does it weaken entire countries? Each of these tests forces slavery into the light. No excuses, no denials, just hard facts. Governments and corporations love to deny slavery exists in their industries. They claim there's no evidence, or it's not widespread enough to be a real issue. These tests rip those excuses apart. If the evidence proves that, slavery is still rampant. It follows clear economic and political patterns. It actively harms development instead of helping economies grow. Then no one can ignore it anymore. That's the goal, not just to expose modern slavery, but to make its existence impossible to justify, deny, or dismiss. Because once we have the truth, the next step is holding the right people accountable. One of the most shocking realities of modern slavery is how cheap human life has become. Unlike historical slavery, where enslaved people were expensive investments, today's forced laborers are disposable. Back in 1850, if you wanted to buy a slave in the United States, it would cost you around $1,000. Adjusted for today's money, that's about $40,000, the price of a decent car or a down payment on a house. Slaves back then were considered long-term investments, which meant owners had a financial reason to keep them alive and working. Now, the price of a human being has dropped to shockingly low levels, lower than a cheap meal or a second-hand smartphone. Ivory Coast. Child slaves forced to work on cocoa farms? $30, less than a pair of sneakers. India. Bonded laborers in brick kilns? $10 to $100, cheaper than a dinner for two. Brazil. Forced labor in illegal mining? $500 to $1,000, less than a new iPhone. Thailand. Girls trafficked into sex slavery? $700 to $1,000, around the cost of a high-end laptop. Back then, slave owners invested in people. Today, traffickers and exploiters treat humans like disposable products. If one enslaved worker dies, gets sick, or escapes, they're simply replaced with another. Because the supply of vulnerable people is endless, and the cost is lower than ever. The takeaway? The world treats human life as a cheap, throwaway commodity. And that's why slavery isn't disappearing, it's expanding. To ensure this isn't just about inflation, researchers compared slave prices using other economic benchmarks. Oxen. In history, a slave cost the same as several oxen. Today, in some regions, an enslaved worker costs less than a single farm animal. Land value. Buying a person once cost the same as an entire farm. Now, it's a tiny fraction of that. Wages. In the past, the cost of a slave was multiple years' wages. Now, it can be cheaper than a month's salary in many industries. What this means: if slavery were truly disappearing, its price would be rising due to scarcity. Instead, we see the opposite. It has become so widespread and accessible that enslaved people are treated as disposable labor. This price drop isn't just an economic shift. It's evidence that slavery has scaled into a mass production system, with human lives as the raw material. Slavery doesn't just happen randomly. It's not some isolated crime that pops up in unlucky places. It follows a pattern, a set of conditions that make exploitation not only possible but almost inevitable. When researchers studied slavery worldwide, they found that certain factors predict exactly where it's most likely to exist. The more of these conditions a country has, the worse its modern slavery problem tends to be. Here are the 6 biggest warning signs. Corruption. The number one reason slavery still exists. If officials can be bribed, traffickers can do whatever they want. In corrupt countries, police, border officers, and labor inspectors look the other way for a price. Businesses that use forced labor face zero consequences. Victims who try to report abuse often get punished instead. High infant mortality, a marker of extreme poverty. A country that can't keep babies alive definitely isn't protecting workers. Parents in desperate poverty send their kids to work because they have no other choice. Families accept dangerous jobs, fall into debt traps, and end up in forced labor. Young, jobless populations, the perfect target for traffickers. When there are too many young people and not enough jobs, traffickers step in. Fake job offers trick desperate youth into forced labor. When the economy fails them, people take any opportunity, even if it's a trap. Food insecurity. Starvation leads to slavery. When people can't afford food, they'll do anything to survive. Debt bondage starts with small loans for food that quickly spiral into lifelong slavery. Starving families sell their children into forced labor or marriage. Overcrowded cities and high population density. More people, fewer protections. Too many workers, not enough jobs equals a race to the bottom. Employers exploit desperate workers who have no bargaining power. Slums and informal labor markets make it easy for traffickers to recruit and disappear. War and political chaos. When the law breaks down, slavery explodes. Where there's war, refugees, or collapsed governments, traffickers take over. Displaced people have no legal protection and are easy to exploit. Armed groups and criminal networks use forced labor to fund their operations. When researchers compared these factors to actual slavery rates, the results were undeniable. Countries with multiple risk factors always had higher levels of forced labor and human trafficking. If a country has several of these warning signs, slavery is almost guaranteed to exist there. This isn't some guessing game. We already know where slavery is most likely to thrive, and that means we also know exactly where to take action. The question is, are we going to do something about it? If slavery were truly good for an economy, the nations that still rely on forced labor would be thriving. But they aren't. Every country that depends on slavery remains poor, unstable, and underdeveloped. Slavery doesn't build wealth. It hollows out economies from the inside. How slave-based economies stay stagnant? No consumer growth. Enslaved people don't earn wages, so they don't buy goods, invest in homes, or contribute to economic growth. Instead of fueling prosperity, slave-based economies become dependent on exploitation rather than innovation. No investment in workers. Why train or educate workers when you can just exploit new ones? Nations that rely on forced labor fail to develop skilled industries, trapping them in low-wage, high-exploitation cycles. No long-term economic stability, because forced labor focuses on short-term profit extraction rather than sustainable growth. Entire industries collapse when the cycle of exploitation breaks down. Countries that have moved away from forced labor by investing in education, technology, and fair labor protections have become global economic leaders. Meanwhile, those that still depend on slavery remain locked in poverty. Slavery isn't just a crime, it's an economic dead end. It benefits a small elite while crippling the long-term prosperity of entire nations. If slavery actually created wealth, the places that still use it would be world powers today. Instead, they are some of the weakest economies on the planet. The message is clear. The only way to build a strong, modern economy is to abandon slavery altogether. We already know where slavery happens and who keeps it running. The biggest problem isn't ignorance, it's the fact that the system protects traffickers instead of stopping them. If slavery still exists today, it's because too many powerful people benefit from it. So if we're serious about shutting it down, the first thing that needs to go is corruption. How to break the system that protects slavery. Zero tolerance for corrupt law enforcement. Anti-slavery laws are useless if police and officials can be bribed to look the other way. Governments need to treat corruption in law enforcement as part of the slavery problem. If cops and border agents are protecting traffickers, they're just as guilty. Put international pressure on corrupt governments. If a country refuses to enforce anti-slavery laws, it shouldn't be business as usual. There should be economic consequences, sanctions, trade restrictions, and public exposure. No country should be able to profit off forced labor without facing the heat. Hold corporations accountable. Big companies love to pass the blame by saying they didn't know their suppliers used forced labor. That excuse needs to die. If a company profits from slavery, it should be legally responsible for every step of its supply chain. No more subcontracting human rights abuses and pretending to be innocent. Protect whistleblowers and victims. People who speak out against slavery risk their lives. Right now, if a victim or worker reports abuse, they could be threatened, imprisoned, or even deported. Until laws guarantee their safety, slavery will stay hidden because fear keeps people silent. Slavery isn't surviving because we don't know how to stop it. It's surviving because too many people are making money off it. So the final question isn't, can we end slavery? It's, are we finally ready to destroy the system that keeps it alive?